Good evening. My name is Janet Gollery McKithen, and I'm one of the founders of the Committee for Racial Justice, and I currently serve on the steering committee. I welcome you to this monthly workshop of the Committee for Racial Justice. We appreciate your concern and your desire to help create a more beloved and equitable world. It will take all of us, so we're so glad that you're here tonight. We're excited about tonight's speaker, who will be introduced later. Some of you may be here for the first time, so I want to let you know something about the Committee for Racial Justice. Committee for Racial Justice began following a racial incident at the Santa Monica High School when a Black student was chained to a locker by two white students in the wrestling room, who then went in the other room to said slave for sale and some other derogatory comments. There was a noose nearby with a brown dummy hanging in it, and there was a 3-week cover-up. The next time after we found out about it, that there was a school board meeting, 40 people spoke at that school board meeting, and several of us created a community-wide workshop after that with Jim Lawson as our first speaker. And from that workshop and that Committee for Racial Justice was formed. That was over 10 years ago, and we've had a strong education focus ever since. Since then, we've had 3 main projects. First, we produce monthly workshops on various aspects of the subject of race. Racism is enormously complex and destructive, so our workshops have been extremely varied. This tonight, right now that you're in, is one of our monthly workshops. If you'd like to come to other monthly workshops and be on our mailing list, put your email and your name in the chat. Second, Committee for Racial Justice works continuously to advocate for Black students in the Santa Monica school system. We persistently push for policies and practices that will benefit Black students. For example, we believe that there needs to be courses that are specifically about Black history and culture, as opposed to just mere access to predominantly Eurocentric courses. Third, the Committee for Racial Justice works to oppose many forms of injustice in the nation's criminal justice system: racial profiling and race-based harassment, excessively harsh sentencing laws, mass incarceration, police shootings of Black citizens, discrimination against individuals exiting incarceration, etc. On the local level, Committee for Racial Justice, along with Santa Monica chapter of the NAACP, the Westside ACLU, and the Peace and Justice Committee of the Santa Monica Unitarian Universalist Church, participate in Coalition for Police Reform. It is the mission of this coalition to eliminate racial profiling, as well as the use of unnecessary force toward Black citizens by the Police Department of Santa Monica. The Committee for Racial Justice also has a book group, which is currently discussing the book Cast. The first few chapters will be discussed this upcoming Saturday morning. Recently, we've also launched a housing committee. But first, I want to turn it over to another member of our steering committee, Angela. Angela?
Good evening, everyone. My name is Angela Scott, and following last summer's racial incidences, the City of Santa Monica created a 15-member public safety reform advisory committee. And through that committee, that committee was appointed by interim city manager, we began reviewing safety policies to make sure that the Santa Monica employed the best practices to recognize humanity, dignity of everyone. On January 26th of this year, the City Council adopted an ordinance to create a new public Reform and Oversight Commission. And in full transparency, I'm on the commission, as well as Derek Devermont and George Brown, who's also on this. So we will abide by the Brown Act as we move through this workshop. I just wanted to be transparent about that. And as many of you know, there were 11 members that were selected. And what I will also do is drop in the chat. We had our first meeting on May 26th. And our next meeting is on June 16th. I will drop that information in the chat. It will also feature what the previous agenda was. And if you continue to follow the website, you will have the links for the upcoming agenda once it's approved, as well as our upcoming meeting. And with that, I will now hand it off to either Tara or Robbie, who can talk to you more about our housing committee here at the Committee for Racial Justice. Thank you.
Okay, like Tara's not on, I'm just going to share real quick that the housing committees work, really coming together really well. Tara is our chairperson, and we most recently have orchestrated a letter for other groups to sign on, a letter regarding the right to return. Santa Monica has this initiative that right to return. They're trying to allow those that were pushed out because of the 10 freeway and because of the Belmar project. A lot of African-American families particularly were pushed out of the communities. And so they want to allow them to be able to come back and live in Santa Monica. And so what that looks like and how we do that is in our letter. And if any of the groups would like to sign on, you can either contact CRJ or Tara Barascas regarding that. So that's where I'll leave it now.
Okay, and now saying that we are now going to be introduced to our panelists. And first we will hand it off again to Robbie.
I have the privilege this evening to introduce someone who I just met a year ago, but has become a main staple in my life in regards to just how resourceful he is and how much information. And his name is George Brown. George Brown has been an attorney for over 3 decades. He retired from an active law practice a few years ago, and his previous clients include large global companies, boards, CEOs, and CFOs in complex, high-stakes financial related litigation matters. Previously, he was also a law professor at UCLA School of Law and has been an adjunct lecturer at UC Berkeley Law School. George was a co-creator of New Era of Public Safety, a guide to fair, safe, and effective community policing, published in March 2019. That publication was the result of an extensive pro bono effort involving over 100 lawyers at his previous law firm, commenced in 2016 in the wake of numerous police killings of unarmed Black men throughout the United States. In 2020, George was appointed to the Santa Monica Public Safety Reform Advisory Committee, where I met him. In that role, he helped create and prepare the committee's recommendations to the City Council, which were approved largely unchanged by a unanimous vote in September 2020. The committee's recommendations included the creation of a permanent Oversight and Reform Commission, along with numerous recommendations for alternative response systems, community engagement, and restorative justice, and recommended best practices for use of force policies. So without further ado, now Commissioner George Brown is on our police commission, and my friend, George, take it away.
Thank you. I assume you've got someone to introduce our esteemed guest, DA George Gascon.
Yes, thank you, George. Yes, actually, I am going to introduce Commissioner Derek Devermont, who will then introduce our esteemed guest. Let me give you a couple of fast facts on my dear friend Derek. Derek is a defense attorney and newly appointed commissioner on the Public Safety Reform and Oversight Commission. He also serves as a disability advocate and California Pest Control Board Vice President. Like I said, here's my fast facts. He's one of California's 20 elected members of the Democratic National Convention. He's a California Party delegate who sits on the Rules Committee, Los Angeles County Party member who sits on the Judicial Interview Committee, Santa Monica Dem Club executive and chair of the Judicial Endorsement Committee. And he's an Abraham Pishaber Pro Bono Clinic Board member. He's represented countless individuals in clearing the criminal and civil obstacles that prevent them from getting off the streets. And my favorite, he's captain at being awesome. So without further ado, here's Commissioner Devermont.
Thank you, Commissioner Scott, who I'm happy to be on a commission with. I'd also point out that Commissioner Carolyn Terosas is here, who is an advocate for housing issues on the Rent Control Board and a personal favorite of mine. But I'm here to do something very special, and that is to introduce District Attorney George Gascon. And I can't tell you how happy I am to say District Attorney George Gascon, because it was not an easy process. But he made it. Mr. Gascon is an unlikely story, and he can tell you about his policies, which are nothing short of revolutionary and are a change, a phenomenal change in the way we view the criminal justice system and its purpose. But his story is unusual. He started out as an LAPD officer, became chief of police of Mesa, Arizona, Mesa PD in Arizona, then became chief of police in San Francisco, and became the district attorney of San Francisco, and now is our district attorney. And as somebody who is in the courtrooms due to his philosophies, I can tell you what was formerly a strictly adversarial, our team, your team environment has now changed to now a feeling where we're not only looking for justice, but we're looking for prevention in ways that benefit the community as a whole. And I can't explain to you what a difference that is. And that's because of Mr. Gascon. Mr. Gascon has brought in new philosophies. He has hired public defenders, career-long public defenders, Tiffany Blacknell, who might still be on here, to work in his office, which just shows that he wants the integrity, he wants all sides of the equation, and his interest is benefiting the community and justice. Now, I can tell you my personal interactions with Mr. Gascon. I met Mr. Gascon when he was campaigning, and he told me a lot of things. Now, I've met a lot of people running for public office in my time. I've met Carolyn Terosas. I've met a lot of people who are running for a lot of different offices. And Carolyn Terosas and Mr. Gascon have two things in common. When I talked to them in their campaign, they told me promises, and I was skeptical of both of them. I've heard a lot of promises, and I've seen a lot of politicians change. But Mr. Gascon, when he became district attorney, followed through on every single one of those promises to a T, without account for politics, but strictly taking into account the community, the law, and what's right. I don't need to tell this group how unusual that is. And that's why it is my honor, my pleasure to introduce the District Attorney of Los Angeles County, George Gascon.
Thank you, Derek. Great to see you, and thank you all. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share time with you today and give you kind of a little bit of an update of where the office is. But I think it's important to sort of take a look back very quickly to kind of piggyback on what Derek said, because I think people sometimes forget what was said during the campaign and what is being done. So, and I'm just going to go really very, very quickly. Obviously, we can get into any details during the Q&A.
DA Gascon, I think the way they wanted to set it up is to have you and I kind of walk through some Q&A to get at exactly where you're going for about 30 minutes, and then take some questioning, if that would be okay with you.
Well, absolutely. Makes it easier for me.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
Let me just add my thank you to your joining us today. We're delighted. We're so happy that you're our district attorney, and we're following you closely and cheering you on. So let me start in. DA Gascon, in November 2020, you were elected as LA District Attorney by a large margin. You received over 2 million votes, the most votes of any DA election in over 20 years and maybe ever. You won in all of the core urban areas of Los Angeles. You won the Latino vote. you won the black vote, you won by at least 260,000 votes. Yet you've been under attack from a variety of entrenched law enforcement interests and politicians in a minority of cities in our county of 88 cities, and mostly in the outlying areas. But they seem to be getting a lot of media attention and trying to undermine your goals as a progressive prosecutor. Here you have with us today a predominantly friendly and welcoming audience. Can you please just take a few minutes and give us an overview of your key goals as LA District Attorney?
Thank you. And I'm going to call you George, and please call me George as well. And that's easier for me and hopefully for you as well.
Okay.
Yeah. So, when I became district attorney, my path to this position was very clear. I wanted to come back home, and I was very focused in doing several things. Number one was reducing incarceration. LA County is the most carceral county, not only in raw numbers because we're the largest, but also proportionally to most other counties in the state and around the country. I wanted to end the death penalty. I wanted to stop prosecuting children as adults. I wanted to provide for more diversion opportunities, especially for people that have mental health problems, substance dependence. And I wanted to increase our police accountability. At the same time, I recognize, especially because as a county, we've had a problem with violence for quite a few years. During the Jackie Lacey period of time, there was an increase of by 25% in violent crime, even though she incarcerated at very high rates. And then on the year before I became elected, which it happened nationwide, but COVID probably had an influence, but there was an upsurge in violence, and that has continued to this day. So it was, how do we find the place to reduce incarceration and begin to address especially violence? So during my first 100, and now we're about 120 days into it, but from the very beginning, we stopped the death penalty. So there were 17 individuals that were on the death track. They're no longer on. We stopped prosecuting children as adults, and that has translated in over 80 kids that would have been in adult court today in possibly adult prisons that will not be there. They're being handled in the juvenile system. We also put together a committee of civil rights lawyers, community members, and some people that have been affected by police violence to begin to take a look back at police shootings going back to 2012. At the same time that I had committed to creating a special prosecutor, and we selected an individual by the name of Lawrence Middleton, who is a former U.S. attorney, U.S. civil rights, worked for the Civil Rights Division. He was actually the lead attorney that prosecuted the Rodney King officers on the federal trial. And he's being brought on board. I anticipate actually early this week. The Board of Supervisors approved his contract late March, and we have been going through the process of getting him on board. So that process will begin in earnest. At the same time, I have brought in more people into our internal unit to look at police shootings, and we have put some new folks in. We put a new manager in that unit, and we're bringing in some additional people.
Great.
While we have done that, we're also beginning to do work around how do we deal with violence through a public health lens. Some of you may have heard that I eliminated the hardcore gang unit a few weeks ago, and that has been met with a lot of opposition by especially a lot of people on the right. It's topic of discussion on Fox News almost every night. But what they don't tell you is that what we did is we have now actually begun to take a look at violence through a public health lens. And what does that mean? What it means is that instead of just simply arresting and prosecuting people, we're actually working with a county health department, and we're bringing social workers, we're bringing community partners on board, as well as the police and prosecutors. And we're beginning to look not just simply at arrest and prosecution, but we're looking at prevention, we're looking at intervention, and we're looking for other vehicles in order to deal with community violence in a very holistic approach. At the same time that we have begun to divert young people away from the courtrooms when it comes to misdemeanors and channeling them into nonprofit organizations that are doing diversion. And for the more serious cases, we're beginning to roll out in another week or so a fully restorative justice model. We're also working with the Office of Alternatives to Incarceration from the county to divert low-level offenses, divert people that have problems with mental health or substance dependence or both, and trying to get them into a pre-filing diversion program so that they can be attended to their needs, held accountable, but not necessarily incarcerated. I know I gave you a lot there. I could go
That's
on.
a good, no, that's a good start, and we're going to come back to several of those. Let me start with the, the pretty good accomplishments you had in your first 100 days, and you told us what they were. How were you able to hit the ground running to achieve those goals, and what kind of internal office resistance did you face, and how did you handle it? How were you able to get those things done so quickly?
Yeah, so, during the campaign, as we were in the political process, I put together with several other people in my team a series of advisory groups, and we put them into buckets. So we had like the police accountability, we had juvenile justice, we had mental health, we had several others. And as we were moving, and by the way, this were all composed of both community but also subject matter experts in each of these areas. And they were crafting policy at the same time that we were running a political campaign. And the crafting of policy really was twofold. Number one, it was a blueprint for the campaign, but it also was the blueprint if I were to be elected. So when I got elected, we immediately turned those policy papers into office directives. And the day that I was sworn in on December the 7th, we actually promulgated each of those as a directive, and they were put into effect immediately. And then we went around a very large office, as I'm sure you all know, there are 22 branches around the county, and basically given very clear directions to our prosecutors to begin to operate under the directives that we have put together. The second part of your question, the dealing with the opposition, it has been brutal. The District Attorneys Association, they campaigned very aggressively against me. They actually put a lot of money against me, as most police unions did. And immediately, as soon as I got elected, they started to undermine the work. That actually led to, they filed a lawsuit. They sought injunctive relief to stop some of my reforms and not using enhancements. Which, by the way, we're in the middle of appealing part of the decision, but the court basically granted some of the things that we're asking, didn't others, and we're now in the process of appealing that. I actually, interestingly enough, as a result, also a judge in the San Fernando Valley refusing to allow one of my lawyers to remove enhancements that is being appealed. The Supreme Court of California actually has now asked for arguments, and it looks like we may be heading to the Supreme Court, which it could be perhaps the best thing that could happen. Maybe we can have resolution to all this. So we got the work because a lot of commitment by a lot of people was done early in preparation for it, and we're dealing now with the opposition, both internally and externally, as you indicated, just simply by just being persistent. Increasingly getting more and more people within the organization to see the value of this. We've now posted on our website actually a number of studies and research, academic research that supports each of the directives that we have put in place, because the other part of this is that I wanted to make sure that what we're doing is supported by science and data. So we have the supporting information there. But we're suffering from the same thing that we're seeing at the national level, right? There are some people that still don't believe that Joe Biden was elected president, and we're seeing the same things. The same people that oppose me, as you well indicated, George. A lot of small cities around the more conservative parts of the county that oppose me are the ones that immediately engage in the recall effort. But I feel very comfortable that, we have a tremendous amount of support from the same groups and the same communities, including many of you that are the reason why I'm here today. And we came in for the fight because it's a righteous fight, and we're going to continue to fight.
Terrific. Thank you. I'd like to ask you a little bit about juvenile crime, sometimes called juvenile delinquency. And in San Francisco, when you were in office, there were programs implemented to address juvenile delinquency, and there were reductions in youth crime, arrest, and incarceration rates. Can you tell us what your plans are for LA County to help disrupt the school to prison pipeline? What kinds of things is your office doing and encouraging other parts of the county to do?
Sure, absolutely. Actually, we borrow a great deal from the San Francisco model, but it's been shaped and restructured because LA obviously is a different place. Not only is it larger, but we have there are different players on board. But basically, the same principles are in place. Number one, we're not prosecuting juveniles for misdemeanor crimes. They're all being diverted, which is, as you well know, and many of you in this chat know, misdemeanor prosecutors are the gateway for criminalizing communities and generally actually creating more insecurity, right? There's a lot of data that shows that early prosecutions for low-level offenses increase the criminality and the likelihood of reoffending in the future. So what we're doing with misdemeanors is we're taking them out of our hands immediately. We're putting them into the hands of nonprofits around the county that have been working on juvenile justice for years. They are the experts, and we're trusting them to do the work. For serious juvenile crime, and underlying that we're no longer prosecuting kids as adults. So that's off the table. Everybody is in the juvenile system, but we're about to roll out a fully restorative justice model. And we're working with community partners so that basically where we can, the kids will be put into a restorative justice model as opposed to a traditional juvenile prosecution, which is what we did in San Francisco with the majority of our cases. There are some exceptions, murder, rape, some of the really more complicated crimes that require a different level of attention. Those are not, but by and large, a lot of serious crimes, we're talking about felony crimes now, are going into the restorative justice model. And by the way, our next step will be go to the 18 to 25 years of age, because the reality is that the threshold of 18 years old is a legal fiction, right? We know that the human brain is not fully developed until you're somewhere in your mid-20s. So while we have different systems, the reality is that we're dealing with human beings that by and large are going to operate with the same wiring. And if we do the right things and the right interventions, which is not incarceration necessarily, we're more likely to get better results.
Great. Thanks for that. Let me ask you a little bit about bail. We know that many folks are incarcerated sometimes for months awaiting trial because they don't have bail money. What's your approach to this issue to make it more equitable?
Yeah, I was the first district attorney in the state back in 2012 that came out against cash bail. We started to work to reduce the use of cash bail. And one of my directives actually was to move away from cash bail. Interestingly enough, the Supreme Court now has basically, in the Humphrey decision, which actually was a San Francisco case as well, has now pretty much embedded into the state law what we were trying to do through a directive. What it means basically is that we will not seek money bail for the majority of the crimes. And when there are cases when we have people that are perhaps dangerous and they need to, they need to be more restricted measures, then we'll go through an evidentiary hearing and we'll determine what that is, whether it's a community monitor approach, or in some cases, in the more serious cases, there may be people that will be incarcerated. Now, where the rub comes in, and for those of you that are not familiar with the Humphrey case, what the court basically says is that you can only put the bail that a person can afford. And what we are doing is in our approach is we're actually trying to take bail completely out of the picture. Now, where we still have a kind of a friction, if you will, it's still within the state constitution, money bail is still in place, and the court did not outlaw money bail. Number one. Number two, for those very serious crimes like murder and possibly other really violent crimes where you have major community concerns, we still do not have fully implemented a good tool to just simply have an evidentiary hearing and hold somebody in preventative custody without paying attention to money bail. I am hoping that we will get to that place, hopefully in the next 90 days or so. But the money issue still comes back sometimes, because if someone wants to post bail and if they have the money, they still get to do it under the law, and that still brings a friction here. But the bottom line is that we're getting people out of jail on pre-trial because they don't belong there. If they're not dangerous, they should be out in the community, they should continue to work, be with a family, and then they can handle their cases outside without being in custody.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to refer you to this document that's on the Prosecutors Alliance website. Prosecutors Alliance is an organization you helped found, and they embrace a report by the Brennan Center and others called 21 Principles for the 21st Century Prosecutor. And I want to ask you about a couple of the things in there, and starting with mental illness and drug addiction.
Mhm.
And generally, the report recommends treatment instead of criminalization. And can you tell us what your office is doing to pursue these principles with respect to mental health and with respect to drug addiction?
Right, and that is precisely what the direction that we're going. So we have increased the number of referrals. We're working with the Office of Alternatives to Incarceration, which some of you may be familiar with. The Board of Supervisors created this office, I think about 2 years ago, and increasingly it's being funded at higher levels. I believe this year they were funded at around $40 million. ATI has identified 10 sites around the county, and I'm actually pleased to say that Santa Monica is one of those cities. Now, because Santa Monica has a city prosecutor, for the misdemeanor type of prosecutions, it will be the city prosecutor. But in all the other places where it's not a city prosecutor, which are most of them within the 10 sites, other than Santa Monica, LA, and Long Beach, we're handling those. And the goal is to do a pre-filing diversion. So when the individual gets arrested, there are social workers that are being deployed 24/7 at the police station. The police will check the person out to make sure that they do not have any violence or any likelihood of being dangerous to their community. And if they don't, they're immediately turned over to the worker, the works at a nonprofit that's contracted by the county at the police station, and then it's a seamless handoff to services. What we are hoping to do is go beyond the 10 sites and eventually be countywide. For the more serious crimes where mental health or substance dependence or a combination of both are included, we're working with the Office of Diversion and Reentry. And similarly, we're looking for alternatives to incarceration where we can. Again, we're growing the program as the county is increasing capacity. Measure J, I am hoping that by the next fiscal year, we'll be able to put a great deal of more funding with many of our partners, both in the public health arena as well as social services, so that we continue to move toward a direction where most of these cases will be handed off away from the criminal justice system.
Okay, thank you for that. Another principle in that Brennan Center report is about changing the DA office culture and practices, and they recommend things like adopting performance standards that reflect your values, making data available to the public, trainings on implicit bias, and that sort of thing. How have you approached this challenge in your first 6 months of trying to change the office culture?
Yeah, this one is a little tougher, but I think also, for people that are involved in organizational development, they will tell you that shifting the organization, the culture of a large organization is a 5 to 8 year project. So generally what lot of experts, and I'm not one of them, by the way, but I read and follow what they're saying, is you have to begin by, number one, creating fairly clear guidelines as to what the expectations are. Number two, you begin to reward the behavior of those that follow the guidelines. And rewarding meaning you promote, you provide better assignments, you increase the sort of the profile of those that are doing the things that you're hoping to accomplish, as well as you obviously use other measures to deal with those that are refusing to follow the directives. So what I'm doing now, we started with the first phase, if you will, was put all these directives in place and basically, hold people accountable to following the directives. We're now beginning to engage within the next 2 or 3 months, beginning to promote some people, beginning to hire some people, and I'm putting this through a very focused lens on people that have the characteristics and express the desire to work within the confines or within the parameters that we're trying to put in place. But that will be a process, and it's going to take some time. So we're now basically on the kind of the more directive approach, and eventually you hope to win people's hearts so that they do it on their own.
Okay. I want to return to police accountability, which is another principle in that Brennan Center report. And I was looking up in the LA Times, they've been tracking police killings over time, and they say there's something like 928 killings by the police since 2000, and it's averaging about 42 killings per year, although it's down the last couple of years. And as you know, disproportionate numbers of Black and brown people are at the consequence of those events. So tell us more. You started to tell us at the beginning about some pretty significant steps you're taking to look into police accountability. Tell us a little bit more about those steps and where you see it going.
Sure. So a couple of things that we've already, well, actually 3 things that we have done is, number one, we put together what we call the FACT Community Advisory Board, which is basically a group of civil rights lawyers, some members of the community actually that have lost a loved one to police violence, and that group is being directed by an attorney who was a former member of the U.S. Attorney's Civil Rights Division. And we also have the UCI Law School Clinic who volunteered to work with them. And what we have done is we're looking back at every police shooting back to 2012, and before my appointment, which is basically approximately 600 shootings. The law school is basically taking a first screening, if you will, and then for cases that they believe that they should have a second look, then that's being bumped up to the advisory board that will take a look, and then our civil rights attorney will screen that further down, and then for those cases that she deems appropriate, they will be brought to my attention. Parallel to that, Mr. Middleton, who is our special prosecutor, has already committed to looking at least 2, possibly more cases that we had identified during the campaign as cases that appear to be extremely problematic, where the office had rejected the case. On cases moving forward, meaning cases where the office had not already determined that the shooting was lawful, we have added more people to the unit, and we're continuing to refine the way that we do that work in order to ensure that if there are shootings that are unlawful, they will be handled appropriately. The other component, and one that frankly in the long run is just as equally as important, if not more, is the integrity of the system, meaning the integrity of trials, the integrity of a working court. So what I did is, shortly after I became the district attorney, I sent a letter to every law enforcement agency in the county basically saying that we wanted to develop a system for all the Brady information. For the non-lawyers in the room, Brady information is information that could be exculpatory. So anything that may impact the credibility of a prosecution witness, in this case, we're talking about law enforcement officers, we have an obligation as a prosecutor to provide it to the defense. And the defense can explore, what the meaning of that information is. Unfortunately, prior to my being elected, the office took a very liberal view, if you will, or perhaps a very conservative view. I don't know how you, meaning that it was high tolerance for bad behavior that was not necessarily being reported under Brady. We are now in the process, and because we have a very broad spectrum of police agencies in the county, and you have the LAPD and the sheriff department, there are multi-dozen officer departments to some really small departments of 20 or 30. So we're trying to tailor our approach depending on the technology that they have available on the work. LAPD has sort of been at the forefront of being very cooperative and actually they're creating an automated process for us to have an up to the moment information on the officers, because by the way, the reality is that it's a moving target, right? Today you may not have anything, and tomorrow you lie in court or you do something that actually impacts your credibility. So updating the information is really important. So we're in that process. To that end, at the same time, we have now filed, since I took office, on 3 different cases involving police officers. Actually, they're all deputy sheriffs, for lying, for perjury, which is the first time in a very long time that the office actually has filed cases for perjury, and frankly, much less this many cases in such a short period of time. And those are cases that are currently ongoing. We have other filings that we've done for other police criminal conduct, but this go to the core of the legitimacy of the system. So all things are moving along at the same time.
Thank you for that. I want to try to get some advice for our new Santa Monica Police Commission. So my next question relates to that. So you've heard that we've just gone through a lengthy process to establish the Public Safety Reform and Oversight Commission. Essentially, it's got broad authority to gather information, have discussions, propose policy changes, give input on the budget, and collaborate with the police department on public safety. In addition, one of the first things it's charged with doing is coming up with recommendations for changes in the complaints, investigations, and discipline process. And I'm wondering in that area, civilian oversight of complaints, investigations, and disciplines, there's been a lot of approaches tried over many decades, and each has some pluses and minuses. I wonder if you have any general thoughts on what we should be thinking about as we address possible improvements in the system of complaints, investigations, and discipline at the Santa Monica level.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I have. I think I can tell you some of the things that I have seen work, and some of the things that I have seen do not work very well. And again, then you have to adjust to your own needs. I think that, to start with, I don't believe that it's wise to have a police department investigate himself, right? So looking for a way to have that work sort of be moved away from the police department, I think is a good idea. And some departments, by the way, do this very well, but it's the minority. It's very hard for a police agency to investigate itself and to do that well. Some of the things that have worked in the past is having an inspector general or having a monitor. And if you're going to do that, you need to make sure that that individual or body, A, is experienced, and B, has teeth, meaning they have to be able to, not only recommend discipline, but the recommendations need to be something that is attended to. In many instances where you have this monitors, if you will, and a perfect example is the LA County Sheriff. You have a sheriff basically that refused to follow the directions of the Office of Inspector General. So you have a really experienced, well-developed Office of Inspector General, but it's been sort of reduced to an advisory role because, the sheriff is not following the rules. Now, I understand the dynamics between the sheriff department and the police department are different. Police chief works for the city council and the mayor. So you have a lot more control there. But I would say that I think it's critically important that either at the investigative end or if not at the review end, that you create some sort of monitoring process that actually has teeth. They can reach out to the decision makers, and when they make findings, that those findings are taken seriously. I think the other parts, you have to look at your contracts, your labor contracts. And, often city councils and mayors are very reluctant to tie discipline to contracts. And so they give up money, they give out benefits and all the stuff, and they don't address discipline issues. And you continue to have a situation where people that perhaps should no longer be a police officer in your agency continue to be, because the contract is set up in such a way that you have some arbitration clause. And by the way, arbitration is probably the worst thing that you can have for police accountability. Arbitrators, by tradition, they want to split the baby, if you will, and because they want to continue to be hired to do arbitration, and most of the arbitrators are a process of selection with two parties. What you have is you end up with a lot of plain vanilla stuff. And police accountability needs to mean something. It cannot be something where a decision is made to end somebody's employment, and then it goes to the arbitrator, and they come back, and maybe they come back with a substantial suspension, perhaps, or maybe not, which really doesn't cure the problem. By the way, I would strongly urge you to move away from the practice of giving police officers that engage in really bad conduct extensive suspensions. I see this, people being suspended for months at a time. It doesn't work. In fact, in my experience, when you suspend people for those lengthy periods of time, when they come back, they've never recovered. They're very bitter. They become a cancer to the organization. If people have done something that is bad enough that they should be suspended for a long period of time, they should be bad enough that you end their employment.
Thanks for that advice. It's going to be useful as we go into this review process. Okay, here's my last question for now, and then we're going to move into getting some general Q&A from the broader audience. Would you agree that in order to achieve your vision of improving overall public safety, reducing recidivism, for example, and pursuing alternatives to mass incarceration, we need actions to be taken by government outside of the purview of the DA's office? And if so, what are some of those things that government needs to do, and how do we get action in those areas?
No, unquestionably. And one of the things that I tell people often when I come to meetings like this is that my job actually is to reduce the footprint of the district attorney's office and the criminal justice system, and really have other members of our community and other experts take a greater role, if you will. So for instance, when you're looking at the way that I am moving to approach violence reduction, we want to take it through a public health lens. So what does that mean? That means that the county board of supervisors is going to have to put more resources into the Office of Violence Prevention, which is under the public health department. Right now, that is a very small unit, very underfunded. If we're going to be serious about using a public health lens to dealing with violence prevention in our county, especially a county of our size, that's going to have to be a very large enterprise. And at the same time that occurs, then we're reducing the litigation side of it and the work that is done by others. Likewise, we need to enhance the way that we deal with social issues through the lens of social work, which means doing less prosecutions and less arrests. That requires, again, in my case, it requires obviously board expenditures and board work, which, by the way, I have to give a lot of credit to the board of supervisors. In the last few years, the board of supervisors really put a lot of money and a lot of efforts to create the bandwidth for a lot of this work. It is a work in progress. We have 88 other cities in the county. Santa Monica is a perfect example. We also need local city councils to make sure they're putting the resources and that they are de-emphasizing criminal justice solutions and putting more money into the intervention side and on the prevention side. And then, my office can play a role in that, but it's a partner to you, it's a partner to your city council, it's a partner to other agencies within the city of Santa Monica or other cities. And often for us, that partnership really means taking a step back so that others can come in and do the work. But I cannot do that unless we have the resources to make sure that we have somebody to be able to take over the work, right? So it's much like we're saying, police should not be responding to mental health calls, which I wholeheartedly agree. But that requires then that the city or the county, depending on who is doing the policing, has to provide the resources to other entities to be able to respond to those calls and to handle them appropriately. So it is absolutely essential that we have not only legislative support sometimes to create statewide legislation to provide the vehicles for some of the work that we're doing, but it's essential that we have executive support by city council, by the board of supervisors and others, because if we're reducing the work of the criminal justice system, there has to be the other components have to step in and take over, and hopefully we'll do a much better job than we can.
Good. Well, George, thank you for this portion of the discussion. I think you've done a good job of kind of walking us through a lot of the major initiatives, and we can understand your perspective and what you're doing. Turn it back over to the moderators now so they can take some questions from the audience and feed them to you. So thank you so much.
Thank you, George.
So I think we have received some questions already in the chat and have gone to Angela or Robbie. So that's how you do it. So if you haven't, directly send Angela your questions.
Okay, thank you. This has been just, I'm just overwhelmed. This is really great. I love listening to you and just your progressive approach. One of our comments is from, and comment/question is from Rod Sprott. He says, I'm so very, sorry about that. He says, I'm so very impressed with your approach to the justice system. Very curious about your personal evolution. It strikes me as quite unique that someone who was a police officer and chief would be so progressive in this justice system. So would you like to elaborate on that?
Sure, absolutely. And it was a journey. I tell people that, and I think to give you a little bit of context too, I grew up in a very poor family in Cudahy. For those of you that not know Cudahy, it's a very little city. It was not even a city when I lived there. It was a unincorporated part of the county, working class neighborhood. I grew up in a very rough and tumble environment as a young kid. Frankly, the sheriff were not our friends. Then I wound up dropping out of high school. I went to the Army. The Army was kind of the place where my life sort of turned around. And by the time I came back, I went to Cal State Long Beach. I had my high school diploma by then. I got my bachelor's degree. And really by sheer, I'm not going to say accident, but by coincidence, I wound up joining the LAPD. And I grew through the ranks and, all the way to be the number 2 running operations under Bill Bratton. But during that process, I went from, being sort of part of the system and then increasingly becoming dissatisfied with our work. And I started to work more and more at the national level in criminal justice reform efforts. I became a member of the Council of State Government Justice Center. We worked in the thing that was called approximately 15 years ago, time flies, we call it justice reinvestment, where it was really the concept of taking money away from prison, putting the money back into reentry programs and reducing incarceration at the state level. We're not successful in California, by the way. We're successful actually in some of the more conservative states like Texas. Interestingly enough, the they reduced incarceration, but the money never went to services. It went back to the general fund to reduce taxes. So there were some shortcomings there. But I continue in that process, and then by the time I became a district attorney, after Kamala Harris became the attorney general, and I worked in her campaign, I campaigned against Steve Cooley because I just didn't believe Steve Cooley was the right person to be our attorney general. Kamala became the attorney general. I have been an attorney now by that time for nearly 20 years. And I was appointed to take her place, and then I ran successfully twice. But the only reason why I became a district attorney in San Francisco by this time is really I was very focused on incarceration reduction. And I wanted to show that you can reduce incarceration and continue to create safety around our community. And in my own evolution, I went from being someone that actually believed the criminal justice needed to be reformed to a place that I gotten now where I really believe that actually it's not about reforming, it's almost about reimagining, recreating the system. And I'm going to tell you why. And it took me a while to get there, not because of historical conflict for me, but just really understanding in depth. If you look at the criminal justice system in this country, and policing and prosecution, by and large, is deeply embedded in the institution of slavery, right? A lot of our policing started with, supporting the institution of slavery. And then there was a civil war, and then people that became no longer legally slaves, then the criminal justice system came in to step in and create a slave-like conditions. And we started to create more and more legislative restrictions so that the people that were previously slaves now, they would be incarcerated and basically put back to work in the same places as instead of a slave, as paying out quote unquote their debt because of a prosecution and incarceration. And you move forward into the 20th century and you get into the latter part of the 20th century, and we just really got this to a science. We incarcerated more people in the last 30, 40 years than anybody else, proportionally and in raw numbers. And what I finally came to the conclusion, actually, the system is working extremely well. The system was designed to incarcerate a lot of people, and it incarcerated a lot of people, right? So it's hard to say that you can improve that system, because improvement would only mean, okay, we're going to incarcerate more people. I don't think that's the answer. So that's why I've gotten to the place where I'm really trying to reimagine how we do the work. That's why I'm talking about a public health approach to violence. That's why I'm talking about bringing all these other partners on board, because I think that the system actually is doing what it was designed to do, and what it was designed to do is not necessarily healthy for our community.
Exactly. Thank you. And I'm going to hand off to Robbie. We will kind of popcorn back and forth. So Robbie has the next question.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you, Mr. Gascon. Lloyd Wilkie would like to ask, he says he's wondering how it is that the DA's Association can interfere with the LA County DA's policies, and how do you respond to those who have blamed your policies on the recent spike in violent crime?
Well, I mean, how can they interfere? They're doing it, right? They're doing it now. I have to say they're getting local support, right? So the Los Angeles District Attorneys Association, which is the union that represents my lawyers, and when I say they represent, not necessarily every lawyer in my office agrees with them, but they have been at the vanguard of joining with the California District Attorneys Association, which, by the way, is one of the most regressive, one of the most anti-reform, anti-reimagining, whatever you want to call it, organizations in the country. It's an organization that consistently has fought every criminal justice reform, every criminal justice improvement effort at the legislative level, and they have coalesced. And they're attacking me legally. They trying to challenge my policies. And they are doing a tremendous amount of work around with the media to lie to the public. And, then we have, unfortunately, we have some media outlets like Fox News that they don't have a problem with putting bad information. They thrive on lying to the public, and we have become so polarized as a nation that people that want to hear that, they go and they believe it and they act upon it. The reality is that if you look at the trajectory of the increase in violent crime in our county as well as our country, because it's a problem that is a national problem, it really started with COVID as far as the major spike. Now, LA County, interestingly enough, actually started to see a violent crime increase by 25% even before that. So where San Francisco actually was reducing violent crime, LA County at the same time under the previous district attorney saw a 25% increase, and that was the 2019. I'm not including 2020, even though LA County was incarcerating at rates higher than 57 other counties in the state. So you can see there's no correlation between incarceration and safety. Then 2020 came in, and everything kind of continued to fall off. And it's interesting, and I was having an interview with KTLA yesterday morning, and they said, well, and I was almost in shock because the anchor, and I think mistakenly so, starts by saying, well, homicides under your leadership have gone up by, there have been 300 homicides. I said, no, that was last year, and I was not the DA last year, other than for about 2.5, 3 weeks. So you can't really put 2020 on me. It has continued to go up, and that's why we're doing the things that we're doing to try to be able to address violence through this public health lens. But as you well know, the DA only plays a role. There are social and economic factors that are impacting what is going on in our community. We have a public health epidemic. We have a mental health epidemic. We have a gun epidemic, right? We have more and more guns in our community. And when you mix mental health, guns, economic desperation, disenfranchisement, you put all the things together, you create a cocktail that creates a lot of bad things. And the only way that we can deal with this effectively by understanding and getting to the root causes of the problem, which is not necessarily incarcerating a bunch of people, is how do we take guns away from our community? How do we deal with mental health? How do we deal with the desperation that so many families in our community are experiencing? Food insecurity, housing insecurity, health insecurity. I mean, you can go on and on and on, right? And all those things are coming up. And, a lot of the people on the right don't want to hear this. They just think that, we can just lock people up and solve the problem. And I tell them, look, if locking people up was a solution, we would not have seen the increases that we have seen. So how do I deal with that? Well, it's, trying to walk people through that, but frankly, depending heavily on people like yourself to multiply those voices and push back into that information that is out there.
Thank you, DA Gascon.
Thank you. So this next question, it's a bit of a comment first, and then I'll summarize what the question is. So it starts out, and this is from Michelle Wittig, who happens to be one of our leads for our Coalition for Police Reform. And so the comment starts, it's no secret that you and Sheriff Villanueva are popular with different segments of voters, right? And have distinct approaches to criminal justice. Some people welcome this because they believe that in the past, district attorneys have been beholden to law enforcement to the detriment of those who've suffered from over-policing and under-protection. Other people are wary. According to this perspective, when our top prosecutor and top law enforcement leader are at odds with each other, our most vulnerable residents are the losers. So in a few words, can you summarize your relationship with Sheriff Villanueva at present and what you'd like it to be, assuming you both remain in office? Like, what are you currently doing to achieve that and moving towards a more amicable relationship?
Well, I mean, there's two components to this, right? The work that deputies are doing in the streets every day and the work that my prosecutors are doing on the streets every day by and large, that continues to go on. Now, it continues to go on through a lens of a much more measured approach from my office, meaning that we're not just simply prosecuting people blindly. Also, that we are demanding a certain level of performance from not only the sheriff department, but all law enforcement, but the work continues to go. When it comes to the sheriff himself, he's the one that taken the path. You know, he wanted me to join him. He created a public integrity unit that really was nothing more than an attempt to intimidate his political enemies. He went after members of the Board of Supervisors. He went after the members of the Office of the Inspector General. And then he invited me to be part of that. And I said, not only I want to be part of that, but understand that public integrity is really the work of the district attorney when it comes to investigating all of that. And I'm going to do that. And I'm not going to be joining you in your effort. He obviously became upset, and then he immediately joined the recall effort. I don't know that there's a capacity for you know, so long as he continues to push for my recall, I think it's going to be hard for us at the individual level to have an amicable relationship. But that's not to say that, you know, I hope that he is a professional as to the obligations of his office. And certainly I am being a professional to the obligations of my office. And that means that we do the things that we're supposed to do in order to protect our communities. And he can deal with his politics at another place and time. And, you know, I'll deal with the consequences of that through the political process.
Great. DA Gascon, another question from Mr. Wilkie is, what are you doing about the gangs in the sheriff's department? And yeah.
Yeah, you know, and here's another area where, you know, the sheriff and I disagree, right? The sheriff just went out a few days ago and said that there are no more deputy gangs. You know, there seems to be evidence to the contrary. We're taking it very seriously, and we're going to do our job. I mean, there are things that I cannot discuss, but we're paying attention.
Thank you for that. So the next question, I'm actually going to yield over to Commissioner Devermont. He has a question, and then after that, we'll continue.
Hello, George. Once again, thanks for coming. The question I'd like to ask you is, as I said in kind of your intro, that you, to me at least, represent a different kind of elected official. You know, elected officials, normally their willingness to compromise goes according to the levels of heat that they receive, and quickly they flip. You seem not to flip on your values and your policies very much at all. So my question to you is, as an elected official, how do you deal with that level of heat and still stay on the right track?
Well, I mean, first, listen, I depend greatly on you guys, right? This is about doing the right thing for the community, right? I tell people that I find myself at a time in history, if you will, where, you know, there are great opportunities to alter the reality of our country in so many levels, you know, and the criminal legal system certainly is one of them. And it was you all, you know, and when I say you all, I mean, you know, you and many others, obviously, that put me in office. And as you indicated very, very early on, I am doing exactly what I said that I was going to do. And I'm going to continue to do it so long as you guys support me. You know, whether recall or whatever is really, at the end of the day, will be, you know, a recall can only be successful if the community decides that it will be successful. Right? The majority of the community continues to support the things that I promised that I would do and that I'm doing, then we are going to be successful. This is not really about me or, quite frankly, any one individual. This is really about what do we want our community and our country to look like in the next 10 or 20 years. You know, I have I'm not old enough. I have grandkids, right? I don't want my grandkids to grow up, and they're very little, so which is a blessing because they still don't get to understand the ugliness around our world today. I want them to grow up in a better place. And the only way that they can grow up in a better place is if we all work together to get to a better place. So for me, all these personal attacks are something that I take in stride because I feel very passionate and very committed to the work.
Thank you for that. Robbie?
I believe I'm done with questions.
Oh,
Actually, Mr. Wilkie did ask, and I don't remember if you answered this one, but what have you done for victims of crime?
Yes, so one of the things that when I became the district attorney, and I say we because it was our entire team, one of the things that I've always said, and as a group we've said, that bringing justice has to be a system of parallel justice. What do we mean by parallel justice? We mean that all the stakeholders, and certainly the victim and those that victimize someone, they all have to be treated with respect, and justice has to, and accountability has to be there for everyone. So I think often people believe, and I know that there are sometimes victims that they want the death penalty, they want punishment, but the majority of the victims, and this has been proven over and over again by studies and by polls, the majority of the victims want accountability, but they also want redemption and rehabilitation. In fact, there was an LA County poll of victims of violent crimes that was taken, I think now it's maybe 2.5 months ago or so. 60% of the victims said, yes, I want the offender or the assailant to be held accountable, but I also want to see redemption and rehabilitation. And the biggest criticism of my office was that we, meaning the LA District Attorney's Office, had not treated them through a trauma-informed lens. To that end, the first advisory group, and we're creating a series of advisory groups that I created as a victims and survivors group. And we are composed actually of a group of women and men who themselves or their family have experienced severe violence. In fact, we have one of our members that lost family members to police violence and has lost family members to street violence. And the reason for that was because we want to make sure that as we are evolving and we're designing new systems in the office, that we're doing it through the lens of victims and through the lens of trauma-informed care. And that is the process that we're following.
thank you so much. I do have a few more questions. I'm going to try to fold them into one another.
Okay, and I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to have to cut off very quickly because I was supposed to end at 7:30, and I do have another commitment in about 10 minutes, but I'll take a couple more, okay?
Okay, awesome. Okay, so then I'll just jump right into it. So a couple of folks asked, how are you going to be, you mentioned some new initiatives, right? So how are we measuring the metrics on that as far as success? How is it being, how will they be monitored? Especially when we talk about the diversion programs and the mental health issues, especially here in Santa Monica and then, LA County as a whole, but that was one of the questions.
Yeah, so there are multiple things that I'm hoping that we're going to create dashboards that are going to be posted. So one of the components will be how many people we divert and how successful we are in those diversions, which is, when I say we, obviously once we divert, it's going to be up to the organization that is handling the work. So we're looking at, the impact of diversion and community safety. We're also going to look at how do we deal with things like, youth justice how do we get kids out of the system and keep them out of the system? The other part is, how do all this interacts with our community, and how do we start increasing the levels of healthiness in our community? And if you notice, I'm not talking about just, public safety, because it's a loaded term, and it's a term that often means very different things to different people. But a healthy community is a community where everybody's thriving, whether your parks, your schools, public places are good places to go to. And there is safety within that network, right? Good people are using open spaces. So what I'm hoping is that collectively we begin to start creating those metrics, rather than just having my office create a bunch of metrics like, how many park crimes are up or down, or how many arrests, or how many convictions, which frankly, at the end of the day, may not have any connection with whether you feel safe or whether your community is healthy or not. So this is obviously more nuanced. It requires more work. It requires more participation by many. And then when you have communities like Santa Monica that have their own city attorney, it gets a little even more nuanced, right? Because there's a lot of work in Santa Monica that is done by your city attorney that my office does not play a direct role, right? So how does a city attorney work with this lower level offenses in conjunction with what we're doing at the county, the level of interventions? Those are all going to be components that we need to start putting together in this process.
Okay, thank you. And again, just two more short questions. One is if you could share a little bit more, if you could speak a little bit more about the restorative justice model that you have. And then the final question is, how can we help in all of this?
So the restorative justice model basically is being run actually by someone that was a career public defender in the juvenile section. Her name is Elisa Blair. And she's the one that is working throughout the county, identifying nonprofits and other partners in the space where the kids will be diverted to instead of being prosecuted. And the goal there is to have a full restorative justice model where you have the victim and the one that has caused the harm to work together. And generally there's a circle, there's a support mechanism. There has to be a admission of wrongdoing, and then there has to be a participation, a partnership with the young person that caused the harm actually has to work with others to repair the harm that they did. And then, so this is rolling out, and I'll be more than happy actually to have Elisa Blair, if you guys want at a later date, make her one of your guest speakers, and she can come in and she can, really get you the whole hour could be about discussing what she's doing with juvenile justice. And how can you help? Well, I mean, you're helping right now by being part of this conversation. I think there's a reality that there are people that are trying to do a recall. They're collecting signatures, so educating your neighbors, your community. We want to make sure that they don't get enough signatures, because what happens is if they do as a statement that that the county is not ready for this kind of work. So the only way that we can push back is actually to ensure that they do not get the signatures that are required, and that can only happen by educating our community, and frankly educating those of you that have media connections and all that stuff. There's a lot of misinformation being put out by local media. One outlet I don't worry about because they're not interested in the truth, but I think the rest of the media by and large wants to do the right thing. So really, for them to hear from many of you will be important, because the other thing is that you hear very loud voices, right? I mean, like there were people demonstrating in my house and they said, oh, we had 70 people. No, you didn't. You had about 20. But to contextualize it, one side and one of the sign said on one side it said recall, and the other sign said COVID is a hoax, right? So that kind of tells you the level of conversations that we're having. So the way you can help really is by pushing back. It's no way that I can, in the county that this large, that I'm going to be able to talk to everybody, but there were, 50, 60 people in this conversation today. For those of you that agree on what I said resonated, if each of you talk to 50 other people about what I'm saying and doing, that will make that grow.
Thank you so much. This is really insightful. And now and I'm sorry, if anyone wants to discuss with your office about a specific case, do they just like pretty much just go to your website and fill out a form?
They can, or also I believe it's still Tiffany Blackmill is here with us today. She's from my office, and you guys can communicate with her. And she is one of our community liaisons. She is also a very experienced attorney. In fact, she was a public defender. She handled homicides and very complex litigation before, and she's doing a lot of our community outreach. So she could be someone that you can talk to as well. Thank you so much, and you all have a wonderful and safe evening. Take care.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye. I will hand this over back to Robbie.
Okay, back to me, and I think I'm gonna hand it over to Janet. But before that, I don't know if it's appropriate for Ms. Blackwell to put her email in the chat, as well as anyone else who uh-oh, I lost it. There's others that need to put if you need more information from CRJ or want to follow up on any of this, please put your emails in the chat.
Right. Thank you, Robbie. I think also what I would just add to that is if you'd like to be a part of this anti-racism work ongoing, if you could put your name and your email and CRJ next to your name, that you could get on our email list. If you put book group in it, you'll get on another list. And like I said, they're studying right now. This is the book that they're reading, that we're reading. So if you're interested, please do that. So I think we're at closing now. And the way we close is we first of all go back to being able to see everybody. Let me see. Maybe. Okay.
Reminder, save chat. Reminder, save chat.
Oh yeah, great. So we do a speak and repeat, and I say something and you say it back. All right, so I'll say it to you and then you can unmute. This is the only time you can unmute all together and be very chaotic. But you repeat after. I'm not. You're supposed to say it now. I'm not free.
I'm not
free.
Until you're free.
Until you're free.
You're not free.
You're not free.
Until I'm free.
Until
I'm free.
So I'm not stopping.
I'm not stopping.
Until we're all free.
So we're
All free.
All right, go in peace, everyone. Thank you, y'all.